There's one thing almost everybody gets wrong about NFTs or non-fungible tokens, and that has to do with the way they are stored on the internet, or are they even stored on the internet, and where exactly are they, and what exactly are they? Kind of the funny thing is that almost everybody, and that means everybody, regardless of if they love or hate NFTs, seems to get that wrong. And that's why I thought I need to do a video. So this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to tell you where exactly are the NFTs, what exactly are they, and what the hell is the interplanetary file system. So let's get started. First of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. An invite link is in the description below. The original motivation for creating this video came from watching an interview that CoffeeZilla did with Geoffrey Huntley. Now, in case you don't know them, CoffeeZilla is a well-known YouTuber, primarily YouTubes about all kinds of scams. In recent months, mainly crypto-related scams. And Geoffrey Huntley is the artist behind the NFT Bay. And if you've never heard about the NFT Bay, that is the art installation that claims to have downloaded all NFTs so that you can simply access them and you don't need to buy them for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Now, in this particular video, Geoffrey Huntley explains very well his motivation behind it. I think he makes a very valid point. However, there's one particular issue with this video that I could not get over, and I want to talk about it. Before I continue, I need to point out that all the channels that I'm going to reference today are some of my favorite channels. I've watched them religiously. I'm a big fan of all of these channels. And my analysis is in no way meant as a critique. It's just kind of the necessity to point something out that these channels get wrong. I am a very small channel, so I'm not expecting that anybody of them is actually watching what I'm saying. But in case they're watching, hey, I love you, and there's something you get wrong. Let's get started by watching a little video clip from that particular interview, which I think explains very well what exactly an NFT is, and it also lays the foundation of what I want to talk about. So let's have a listen.
Wait, hold on a second. When I buy an NFT of a Bored Ape or a Lazy Lion, I'm not actually purchasing that picture? What am I actually buying?
No, you're essentially buying a piece of data, and that data has a link to where the image can be located.
So like a URL? Is that what you're saying?
It's a URL. Go look at Etherscan and look at the contract and have a look at it. Literally, people are buying a link, like directions on a treasure map to a treasure. And they're saying that the treasure is the artwork. And the only reason people are buying stuff is for the treasure or the artwork. But what's actually being sold is the directions to the treasure.
Now, I actually like Geoffrey Huntley's analogy with the treasure map, because that's actually very fitting. If you buy an NFT, what you essentially get is a smart contract, and the smart contract contains a link to something that contains the content or the artwork. The problem is that this link can mean different things. And in this particular video, what they actually shown is an IPFS link. And this is really the critical point, because an IPFS link is more than just a link to something on the internet. Now, while this is not really a problem at that point, it gets a little bit more problematic in the second clip that I'm going to show you.
Do you own the IPFS address? Like, let's say I buy a Pudgy Penguin. Do I own that domain where the file's located? What do I own?
You own an entry in a database that directs you how to access that image on IPFS. That's it.
So theoretically, someone could go in and change the data at the IPFS or the drive link or wherever they're storing the data.
Happens all the time. If you're following NFTs and the developments, it's called a rug pull. They sell the database entry on blockchain, and blockchain is immutable and it cannot be updated, but they host the image elsewhere, say on Google Photos or Google Drive. And then once the art is sold, the database entry is sold, they just switch it to a picture of a rug.
Now, this is actually where the problem starts, because the content that is addressed through an IPFS address cannot be changed. It is immutably connected to the IPFS address. It's not that you can simply kind of swap out the contact and swap out the image, and then you suddenly have a different image to the same IPFS address. That's not possible. It's technically not possible. Those things are immutably linked. Now, I do believe that Geoffrey Huntley and Kofi Silla both knew that, and that the error happened in the editing of the video. However, it has become somewhat of a ubiquitous opinion that you can simply swap out anything that sits on at an IPFS address and can replace it with some other images, and that is simply not true. Now, in order to demonstrate that this is actually an opinion that's now almost everywhere, I'm going to show you one more clip from another channel that I really like, and that is Legal Eagle. And he recently did an NFT video where he made the same mistake. So let's have a listen at that one.
NFTs are also a product of programming, and as we've seen time and time again, those programs can fail. An NFT can be corrupted. The reference work can be rug pulled. You can change the reference work. Even if you're pointing to an IPFS file, that can change.
No, the file an IPFS address is pointing towards cannot be changed. That's technically not possible. Now, I do have to say that there's a possibility to swap out the IPFS address, provided that the smart contract allows you to do that. So if I would actually have to fight that in court with Legal Eagle, he would probably win because he could make that argument. But the way he presents it, that you can simply swap out the file at the end without changing the IPFS address in the smart contract, that's simply not possible. Now, I want to show one other little clip from another video that was published on the very same day from Stephen Mould, which I think is the best video about NFTs that I've seen so far. So if you are interested in NFTs and you want to listen to somebody who has a very differentiating opinion, neither fully in favor nor fully against, and kind of really tries to be as objective as possible, the Stephen Mould video is probably the best that's currently out there. And let's have a listen. There's actually one thing I almost felt we are there, almost, but only almost. He made a little boo-boo at the very end. So let's have a listen.
If you asked me now, are NFTs stupid? I'd probably say they don't have to be. I guess my beef is just with the way people talk about them. Like when you buy an NFT, you're not buying the artwork. You're not buying an NFT of the artwork. You're buying an NFT that points to the location of the artwork on the open internet. And that's okay, so long as we're all honest about that.
So close. And I really mean so close, but in the end, it is not completely correct. And this is actually the main reason I wanted to make this video today, because I see these misconceptions popping up everywhere, and we need to talk about those. So let's have a look into how IPFS actually works. But for that, we need to understand what IPFS actually is. So let's just have a brief introduction into IPFS. IPFS is short for Interplanetary File System, and that seems to be a very childish name, but it does actually make a lot of sense if you think about it, because what it's trying to do, it is trying to solve a problem that an interplanetary society would have. If you have, for example, a society where we have some colonies on Mars and some colonies on the belt, and we need to communicate and we need to access a common internet, that internet cannot be centralized, because if you need to access information from Mars that is stored on Earth or even on the belt, there's just no way to do that in any feasible way. I mean, it takes a lot of time to complete a request, and therefore you can't really do it in a centralized way. So what you need to do is you need to decentralize your file structure, and that is what the Interplanetary File System solves. Now, without going into technical details, because the technical background of IPFS is actually fairly complex, what we need to know is that IPFS is essentially a decentralized file storage system. As a decentralized file storage system, we can no longer rely on the physical location of the data on a particular server. So the address, the traditional address, the way we use it currently, would not work, because we don't really know where the files are. They might be distributed on all kinds of servers and floating around between Mars, Earth, and the belt. They could be anywhere really, or probably are everywhere. Now, to get around that, what you're doing is, instead of using a physical location or a server address, you are addressing the content by what's called a content identifier, instead of a storage location. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the content identifier is now directly connected to the content. So how does this look like? And as an example, I'm using an NFT that I minted myself. It's a little music video. I minted that during a class I taught 2 or 3 terms ago. If you go into the smart contract, you will find the location of the actual content of that video to be an IPFS address. And this is essentially the IPFS address. So it starts with IPFS, and then you have a bunch of letters and numbers. And this bunch of letters and numbers, that is the content identifier. This essentially identifies the content. So it looks very similar to a regular web address. It doesn't start with HTTP or HTTPS. It starts with IPFS, and then it doesn't really have a domain or anything. It has a content identifier, which is a long string of letters and numbers, and looks very random and most certainly not something that I would remember. Now, how do you access the IPFS address? You obviously simply can't take the IPFS address and put it into the address field of a regular web browser. That browser would probably not know what to do with it. Now, there are certain browsers who support IPFS natively. Brave is one of them. So if you have the Brave browser installed, you can simply take the Brave browser and take the IPFS address and put the IPFS address into the address field, and the Brave browser will know exactly what to do with it. But most browsers have no idea what IPFS is. So how do you do that? Well, the way you work around it is with what's called an IPFS gateway. And an IPFS gateway is essentially just a server system that converts an IPFS address into a regular web address so that it becomes accessible through a regular web browser. And this would be an example of a gateway that is hosted by a company called Pinata. For those of you who are familiar with NFTs, you probably heard about Pinata. It is a service provider in the IPFS domain. So they kind of provide pinning services for IPFS files. And that's the gateway that they use, and that's the way it would look. And once again, we have the content identifier in this particular address. Now it's a Web3, a regular web address. It's not an IPFS address, but it still contains the content identifier. So far, so good, but what exactly is the content identifier? So let's have a look at the structure of the content identifier, because that's actually where it gets really, really interesting. Now, this is the one thing that almost everybody gets wrong, and that is the fact that the content identifier is not a location. It is not something that points to a certain location on the public internet, as Stephen Mould put it. What it is a multi-hash of the content itself. Now, for that, we now would need to know what a multi-hash is, and I cannot go into too many details here because it gets very, very technical. The thing you need to know is that the multi-hash is essentially a form of a cryptographic hash. And the cryptographic hash, the best way to really kind of understand that is by thinking of it as a fingerprinting device. So if you take a content and you create a cryptographic hash of the content, you're essentially creating a fingerprint of that particular content. And that essentially means if you have the content and the fingerprint, you can sort of reference them. So essentially the fingerprint and the content belong to each other, and the fingerprint, the cryptographic hash, can prove that it came from that particular content. And in between is what's called a cryptographic hash function. That is a hash function that has certain properties. I did explain it a little in the video about blockchain. So if you're interested, I invite you to watch that video. Link is in the description below. But in essence, that's really everything you need to know. A cryptographic hash is a fingerprint of the content, and the multi-hash is a form of a cryptographic hash. Now we can actually look into how this multi-hash actually looks by looking into an IPFS Explorer. So let's do that. Now what I've done here is I've taken the example that I used before and plugged it into the IPLD Explorer. The IPLD Explorer is essentially a service that allows you to deconstruct the content identifier into its individual components. Here we have the content identifier. In case you've memorized it from the previous slides, this is essentially what we had in the IPFS address. And what IPLD Explorer is doing is it's taking the content identifier and it's deconstructing it into its individual components. And there are a couple of components in there that sort of specify what type of hash function is used, what version is used, and so forth. So it is deconstructing it into its individual data components. And the important thing for us to understand is that somewhere in there is the actual cryptographic hash. And this is the cryptographic hash that is sort of part of that particular content identifier. We also know that that is a cryptographic hash that has been hashed in the SHA-2 256 or with the SHA-2 hashing function. And this is the reason why it's called a multi-hash, because it allows you to use different types of hashing functions. So in case at some point in time, SHA-256 is no longer the hashing function of choice, IPFS can simply use a different hashing function and it would work in exactly the same way. So you don't have to change any content just because you're changing the underlying hashing function. So that's essentially where the reason for this multi-hash approach comes from. But for us here, it's important to understand that we have a hash according to the SHA-256 cryptographic hashing function that belongs to the content, and that is used as part of the content identifier, which is once again used as the address in the IPFS address. So in summary, what we have is that the content identifier that is used in an IPFS address consists of a cryptographic hash of the content together with some metadata that defines what type of hashing function has been used. And that is incredibly important to understand. At this point, you might think, well, Michael, that's all fine and good, but you just give a very complicated explanation on how addresses are used in smart contracts. And to some extent, that is correct. But this is actually an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, because we now have a cryptographic link between the address and the content itself. And that has a couple of very, very important consequences for understanding how off-chain content is used on the blockchain. Now, the first consequence we already talked about, and that is because the address contains the cryptographic hash of the content, it is impossible to replace the content without changing the address. You simply cannot do that. And because it is a cryptographic hash function, you also cannot change it in a smart way. So it's not like you can figure out, maybe we can find another piece of content that just happens to have the same hash according to SHA-256. That is simply not possible in a lifetime. So we can be sure, as long as we use IPFS, that the IPFS address is immutably connected to the actual content. So that's the first thing that's really important to understand. We cannot change, and I cannot stress this enough, we cannot change the content that is connected to an IPFS address, because the IPFS address contains the cryptographic hash of said content. The second consequence is one that is even more important and that I actually have not heard anybody talk about yet. And that is the fact that because the content identifier is nothing but a fancy hash of the original content, it is actually completely irrelevant where that content is. It does not need to be on the internet. It can be on my local hard drive here somewhere with no connection to the internet whatsoever. If I take my content and I have the content identifier stored in a smart contract, I will always be able to prove that this content belongs to this content identifier, because the content identifier is just a cryptographic hash of that content. It does not need to be on the internet. And by that, I also mean that the content identifier does not point to a location on the internet, as Stephen Mould would say. It is essentially a cryptographic link to the original content, and whether or not that content is on the internet or not is completely irrelevant. And this brings me to a quote from the famous Folding Ideas video about NFTs. Line goes up. The problem with NFTs. If you have not yet seen that, I highly recommend watching that. It is very entertaining, and he makes a couple of interesting points. But there's one thing in there which he actually did not get either. And let's have a look at, let's have a listen on what that actually was.
More than that, there was no cryptographic relationship between the image and the tokens. The image associated with a token could be easily altered or replaced if the person with access to the server that the image was hosted on just changed file names, making the relationship between the two tenuous and flimsy in a way that undermined the claims that this was somehow a more durable, reliable way of transacting digital art.
And that is just wrong. The content identifier, as we just established, contains the cryptographic hash of the content and is therefore cryptographically linked to the original content. So as long as you use IPFS, you have this cryptographic linkage. And it's not just a location on the internet where you can change the files. It actually is a proof. It is the fingerprint of the original content. And once again, if you have that content on the internet or anywhere or locally, or it doesn't matter, as long as you have access to it, and you have the content identifier in the smart contract, you can prove that the contract and the content identifier belong together, and therefore they are essentially linked with each other. So you cannot simply replace them. Now, before I conclude my video, there are a couple of caveats that I need to make. And the first one, obviously, is that this all only works if you're using IPFS in your smart contract. So if you're minting an NFT, or if you're buying an NFT, make sure that the content is addressed through an IPFS address, because the IPFS address essentially establishes that cryptographic link between the content and the content identifier. If you're using a regular HTTP address, then it's just fair game for anybody to replace that content at that HTTP address, and you cannot really kind of control that in any way, shape, or form. So make sure that the content is addressed with IPFS. And the second one, obviously, is that the smart contract should not allow you to change that IPFS address. Because of the immutability of the blockchain, some developers took the lazy road and implemented functions that would allow you to switch out the content address and therefore also switch out the IPFS address. And obviously, if you can switch out the IPFS address, you can also switch out the content that's associated with it. So if you buy an NFT, make sure to read the smart contract and make sure that the smart contract does not contain a function that allows somebody to screw you over. That's probably true for any contract that you sign. Now, while I've been writing on this one particular issue, I have to say that all of the videos that I've been referring to today make one point that I think is very important, and that is to understand that the NFT space is a space in development. There are many things that are not going correctly at that point. There are many things that are weird. There are many things that are scammy. There are many things that are used for people to from people to scam other people and to make a quick buck somewhere. And there are also certain political motivations behind it. There's a certain level of free thinking that kind of drives this development. And people need to be aware that everything in that space is still connected to the traditional way of doing business. This is one thing that I think Legal made completely clear, is that kind of NFTs are nice, the smart contracts are nice, but in the end, there is contractual law that sits underneath, and there's just no way around that. So if you're working with NFTs, if you're working with crypto, if you're working in that particular space, in the blockchain space, you need to be aware that this is not a radical transformation of everything. It is an evolution. It is an addition of certain technology that enhances things that we have done in the past with new technology in different ways. And it's not going to replace stuff. It's just going to augment things. And that's important to understand. So we need to think of blockchain technology, NFTs, and anything around it as something that is exciting, that will transform certain things, but it's not going to replace certain things. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. For those of you that are still with me, thank you very much for watching my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below, or once again, join my Discord community. A link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.